The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across the Nebraska territory, where the horizon stretched endless and unforgiving. Mary Sullivan stood at the edge of her small homestead, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun that painted the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. It was the autumn of 1876, and she had been alone for 3 months now, ever since cholera had taken her husband Samuel. The cabin behind her was modest, 4 walls of rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney that leaked smoke, and a roof that groaned under every storm. Samuel had built it with his own hands, promising her it would be their beginning, their chance at the American dream. Now it felt more like a tomb, filled with memories and the echo of silence. Mary wiped her hands on her faded calico dress, the blue flowers barely visible anymore after countless washings in lye soap. At 24, she was young to be a widow, but the frontier aged women quickly. Her once soft hands were now calloused from working the small vegetable patch, hauling water from the creek, and chopping wood for the coming winter. Her auburn hair, which Samuel had loved to see loose and flowing, was now always pulled back in a severe bun, practical for the endless work that survival demanded. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was a day's ride away. A collection of wooden buildings that passed for civilization, a general store, a saloon, a church with a bell that rang hollow across the plains. She went there once a month for supplies, enduring the pitying looks of the townswomen and the hungry stares of men who saw a young widow as either a tragedy or an opportunity. That evening, as Mary prepared her meager supper of cornbread and beans, she noticed the strange stillness that had fallen over the land. The usual chorus of crickets had gone silent. Even the wind, constant companion of the prairie, had died away. She paused, wooden spoon in hand, listening. Her father, a cavalry officer before his retirement, had taught her to read the signs of danger. The land speaks, Mary. He'd told her, you just need to learn its language. The horses in the small corral began to whinny nervously, their ears flat against their heads. Mary moved to the window, peering through the thick glass Samuel had hauled all the way from St. Louis. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. But there was something else, a dust cloud rising in the distance, too organized to be buffalo, too fast to be settlers. Her heart began to pound as she reached for the Winchester rifle mounted above the door. Samuel had taught her to shoot, made her practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. The frontier doesn't forgive those who can't protect themselves, he'd said. She checked the ammunition, 5 shots in the rifle, a box of cartridges in the drawer. It wouldn't be enough if there was real trouble coming. The dust cloud grew larger, and now she could hear it, the thunder of hooves, the wild cries that made her blood run cold. Lakota. The word whispered through her mind like a curse. There had been raids throughout the territory since the Battle of the Little Bighorn that summer. The Army's defeat had emboldened the tribes, and isolated homesteads were easy targets. Mary barricaded the door with the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she pushed the heavy oak across the floor. Through the window, she could see them now, warriors on painted ponies, their face fierce with war paint, some carrying torches that blazed against the darkening sky. There were at least 20 of them, moving with the fluid grace of men born to horseback. She positioned herself at the window, rifle ready, though she knew it was hopeless. A single woman against a war party. The outcome was inevitable. Still, she would not go quietly. Samuel wouldn't have wanted that. The first flaming arrow struck the roof, and she heard the dry wooden shingles catch immediately. Smoke began to filter through the ceiling as more arrows followed. The warriors circled the cabin like wolves, their cries echoing across the prairie. Mary fired once, twice, seeing a warrior tumble from his horse. But there were too many. The smoke grew thicker, and she knew she had to get out or burn alive. As she unbarricaded the door, coughing from the smoke, she whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for courage. The door burst open, and she stumbled out into chaos. The world exploded in sound and movement. Horses thundered past, so close she could feel their breath. Warriors shouted in a language she didn't understand. She raised the rifle, but strong hands wrenched it away. Someone grabbed her arms, and she fought wildly, scratching and kicking, until a blow to her head sent stars spinning across her vision. As consciousness faded and returned in waves, she was aware of being lifted, of the ground moving beneath her. Through the haze of pain and smoke, she saw her home engulfed in flames, everything she and Samuel had built together turning to ash against the night sky. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt and soot. Then she saw him, the one who held her across his horse. Even in her dazed state, she couldn't help but notice his presence. He was taller than the others, his shoulders broader, his bearing that of command, unlike the younger warriors with their painted faces and wild energy. He wore his authority like a second skin. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were dark as the prairie night, holding depth she couldn't fathom. He spoke sharply to the other warriors in their tongue, and she noticed how they immediately obeyed, pulling back from their revelry of destruction. This was no ordinary warrior. This was a chief, a leader of men. The realization filled her with a different kind of dread. Common warriors might ransom a captive or trade her, but a chief— she had heard the stories, whispered in the general store, of white women taken as prizes, as symbols of victory against the encroaching settlers. As the war party rode into the night, leaving the burning homestead behind, Mary's last coherent thought was of Samuel. She had failed to protect what he'd built, failed to die defending it as he would have. Now she was caught between worlds, the one burning behind her and the unknown darkness ahead. The chief's arm held her steady against him as his horse galloped across the prairie. And despite her hatred, despite her fear, she was struck by the strange gentleness in his grip, as if she were something precious rather than merely plunder. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, as the war party disappeared into the vast wilderness of the frontier, carrying her toward a fate she couldn't imagine. The journey stretched endlessly through the night, each hoofbeat carrying Mary further from everything she had known. Her wrists were bound with rawhide strips, not cruelly tight but secure enough to prevent escape. The chief had draped a buffalo robe over her shoulders when she began shivering, the gesture confusing her anger with unwanted gratitude. They rode through landscapes that shifted like dreams, across moonlit valleys where the grass whispered secrets, through narrow canyon passes where the stars seemed close enough to touch. When they forded the Niobrara River, the cold water shocking her fully awake, she gasped and heard what might have been concern in the chief's voice as he spoke words she couldn't understand. Dawn found them in the Badlands, where twisted rock formations rose like ancient sentinels. The war party finally stopped to rest the horses. Mary was lifted down, her legs barely able to support her after the long ride. She stumbled, and again those strong hands steadied her, more gently than she expected from someone who had just destroyed her life. For the first time in daylight, she truly saw the man who had taken her. He stood well over 6 feet, unusual even among his people. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung long and was adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status. His name, she would later learn, was Lakota, meaning friend to all in his language, though she would find bitter irony in that translation. His age was difficult to determine, perhaps 35 winters, his face carved by experience into something both harsh and noble. The warriors made no fire, eating pemmican and dried berries from painted parfleche bags. One of the younger warriors, his face still painted in the fierce patterns of war, approached Mary with water in a buffalo bladder. She wanted to refuse, to spit in his face, but thirst won over pride. As she drank, she noticed Lakota watching, his expression unreadable. They rode for 3 more days, stopping only when necessary. Mary's world shrank to the rhythm of the horse, the ache in her bones, and the strange security of the chief's presence behind her. She hated herself for finding any comfort in it. But when exhaustion threatened to topple her from the horse, his arm would tighten, keeping her safe. On the fourth dawn, they crested a ridge, and Mary's breath caught. Below lay the Lakota camp, dozens of teepees arranged in careful circles, smoke rising from morning fires, children playing in the spaces between. Dogs barked at their approach, and people emerged to see the returning war party. Women ululated in celebration, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed both foreign and anciently familiar. As they rode into camp, Mary felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. Women paused in their work, scraping hides, tending fires, caring for children, to stare at the white woman their chief had brought home. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed open hostility. Children ran alongside the horses, pointing and chattering excitedly. Lakota dismounted and lifted Mary down, speaking rapidly to an older woman who approached. This woman, her gray hair braided with beads and her dress decorated with elaborate quill work, studied Mary with sharp intelligence. She was Winona, Lakota's aunt and one of the matriarchs of the band. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly, but gestured for Mary to follow. The teepee Winona led her to was smaller than the others, set slightly apart. Inside, buffalo robes covered the ground, and painted designs decorated the liner. Winona pointed to a spot, clearly indicating Mary should sit. Then, with surprising efficiency, she produced a knife and cut Mary's bonds. Mary rubbed her chafed wrists, watching warily as Winona brought water in a decorated bowl and clean cloths. The older woman's ministrations were brusque but not unkind as she cleaned the cuts and bruises from Mary's capture. All the while, she spoke in Lakota, her tone suggesting she was either explaining something or perhaps complaining about the extra work. Over the following days, Mary existed in a strange limbo. She was not exactly a prisoner, no one bound her or locked her away, but neither was she free. The camp's boundaries were her prison walls, enforced by the vast wilderness beyond and her complete ignorance of how to survive it alone. She was put to work, which surprised her. She wasn't sure what she had expected, to be kept as some sort of trophy. Instead, Winona taught her to scrape hides, though Mary's inexperienced hands made a mess of the first several attempts. The work was hard, harder than anything on the homestead, and her back ached constantly from bending over the stretched hides. Some of the women were cruel, accidentally, kicking dirt into her food or jostling her as they passed. One young woman, beautiful and proud, seemed particularly hostile. Mary later understood this was Lakota, who had hoped to marry Lakota. But others showed small kindnesses. A girl named Chumani would sometimes help her with the heavy work, and an elderly woman would correct Mary's technique with patient gestures. Lakota kept his distance those first weeks, though Mary often felt his presence. He would stand at the entrance of his teepee in the evenings, arms crossed, watching the camp's activities. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the cooking fires, and Mary would look away first, disturbed by the intensity of his gaze. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Mary sat exhausted outside the teepee, her hands raw from the day's work. She was surprised when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find Lakota standing there. He held something in his hands, her mother's locket, which she had worn the night of the raid. "This yours," he said in halting English, the words heavily accented but clear. Mary's hand flew to her throat, where the locket's absence had been a constant ache. She reached for it, but he pulled back slightly. "You—" He paused, clearly searching for words. "You know, try run." Mary understood. The locket for her promised not to escape. She nodded slowly, and he placed the gold chain in her palm. His fingers brushed hers, and she jerked back as if burned. "Why?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. "Why did you take me?" He studied her for a long moment, and she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I lead warriors," he said, touching his chest. Then his hand moved toward her, not quite pointing. "But you lead my heart," The words hung between them like smoke from the evening fires. Mary stared at him, unable to process what she'd heard. This man, who had destroyed her home, who had torn her from her life, was speaking of his heart. "You killed," she began, but he was already walking away, his broad back disappearing into the gathering darkness. That night, Mary clutched the locket and wept silently, confusion adding another layer to her grief. She was a captive in a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people whose language and ways were foreign to her. But most unsettling of all was the realization that her captor, this fierce chief who led warriors into battle, had just confessed something that changed everything and nothing all at once. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched her journey here, and Mary wondered if she would ever find her way back to the world she knew, or if that world had died along with her burning homestead. In the distance, she could hear drums and singing, the sound both mournful and beautiful, like the cry of the prairie wind through an empty house. The moon waned and waxed again as Mary's days fell into a rhythm of survival. Each morning began with Winona's sharp voice calling her to work, and each night ended with exhaustion so complete that even her dreams couldn't find her. The blisters on her hands had hardened to calluses, and her fair skin had darkened under the prairie sun. But the ache for home remained constant as a heartbeat. She learned to navigate the complex social structure of the camp through observation and painful trial. The women worked in groups, their hands busy with endless tasks, while their tongues were equally busy with gossip she couldn't understand. Mary recognized her name, or what they called her, Maka Ska Win, White Earth Woman. In their conversations, often followed by laughter or disapproving clicks of tongues, Ayota remained her chief tormentor, finding subtle ways to make Mary's work harder. She would place the poorest quality hides in Mary's pile, or accidentally spill the ash mixture used for removing hair, forcing Mary to start over. Once, she spoke at length to a group of younger women, gesturing toward Mary and then to Koda's teepee, causing them all to giggle behind their hands. Mary didn't need to understand the words to know she was being mocked. But there were unexpected moments of humanity, too. When Mary sliced her palm on a sharp scraping tool, Chumani wordlessly took her to the medicine woman, who packed the wound with herbs and wrapped it in soft doe skin. An old woman named Wikapi taught her to identify edible plants, patient with Mary's fumbling attempts to pronounce their Lakota names. The children were the least complicated in their interactions. After their initial wariness wore off, they would cluster around her, fascinated by her pale hair and blue eyes. One little girl, no more than 5 winters old, would bring Mary small gifts, a pretty stone, a feather, a handful of late berries, leaving them shyly before scampering away. It was during her 3rd week that Mary witnessed something that shattered her preconceptions. A group of warriors returned from a hunt, their horses laden with fresh game. The entire camp buzzed with activity as the women prepared to process the meat. But what struck Mary was how the distribution was handled. The elderly and families with many children received their portions first. Lakota personally carried meat to a teepee, where a warrior lay recovering from an injury, and to another where a widow struggled to feed her children. That evening, as the camp celebrated the successful hunt with singing and dancing, Mary found herself watching Lakota from across the fire. He sat with the elders, listening intently as they spoke, occasionally offering his own words. When a young warrior approached him with what appeared to be a dispute, Lakota heard both sides patiently before rendering judgment that seemed to satisfy everyone. "You watch him much," Winona said in her broken English, settling beside Mary with surprising spryness for her age. Mary flushed, looking away. "I don't—" "He good man," Winona continued, ignoring Mary's protest. "Hard man, yes, must be hard, but good." She pointed to the scar that ran along Lakota's jaw, visible even in the firelight. "Crow warriors, 5 winters past. They come for our children. He fight, save children, almost die." Mary didn't want to hear this, didn't want to think of her captor as anything more than the savage who had destroyed her life. But the image persisted. Lakota defending children, bleeding, nearly dying for his people. Why did he take me? Mary asked quietly. Winona studied her for a long moment. You see his eyes when he look at you? I try not to look. The old woman chuckled. Maybe you try harder. She rose, joints creaking. Tomorrow, you come my teepee. Learn make wasna. Useful skill. As the celebration continued around her, Mary's gaze was drawn back to Lakota. He was dancing now with the other warriors, his movements powerful and graceful. The firelight played across his features, and for a moment, she saw him not as her captor, but as a man carrying the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. That night, her dreams were confused tangles of images. Samuel's face fading into smoke, her burning home, Lakota's eyes across the fire. She woke with tears on her cheeks, her mother's locket clutched in her fist. The next morning brought an unexpected change. Instead of being sent to work with the women, Mary was summoned to Lakota's teepee. Her heart pounded as she approached, unsure what this meant. Inside, she found him sitting cross-legged, various objects spread before him on a painted buffalo robe. Sit, he said, gesturing to a spot across from him. Mary sat warily, her muscles tense and ready to flee. You fear me, he stated. It wasn't a question. You destroyed my home, killed. Her voice broke. Warriors die in war, he said quietly. Your people take our land, kill buffalo, bring sickness. We fight this way of things. That doesn't make it right, Mary said, anger giving her courage. No, he agreed, surprising her. Many things not right, but we survive as we can. He picked up one of the objects, a beautifully quilled medicine bag. This my mother's. She die when soldiers attack our winter camp. I am boy. 10 winters. Mary didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this, her captor sharing his own losses. Why you take me? She asked again, the question that haunted her nights. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. First time I see you, at your wooden house. You stand with gun, ready fight 20 warriors, no fear in your eyes, only... He searched for the word. Fierce, like eagle mother protecting nest. You were watching before the attack. We watched 2 days. Learn who lives, who dangerous. You, alone, should run, should hide. Instead, you stand, fight. He met her eyes. My heart speaks then, says this woman strong, special. So you destroyed everything I had? Mary's voice was bitter. I save you, he said simply. Other warriors want kill all. I say no, say you mine. The possessiveness in that statement should have infuriated her. Instead, Mary found herself confused by the complex emotions it stirred. I'm not a thing to be owned. No, he agreed again. You are. He switched to Lakota, then shook his head in frustration at the language barrier. Finally, he placed his hand over his heart. Here, you are here. They sat in silence as Mary struggled to process this. This man, this chief, who led warriors and made decisions of life and death, was telling her she lived in his heart. It went against everything she believed about Indians, everything she'd been taught. I can't, she whispered. My husband, he is gone. Lakota said gently, you mourn. This good. But you live, must choose life. Before Mary could respond, a commotion outside interrupted them. Voices raised in alarm, and Lakota was on his feet instantly, reaching for his weapons. He spoke rapidly in Lakota to someone outside, then turned to Mary. Stay here, he commanded, and was gone. Mary peered out of the teepee to see warriors mounting horses, women gathering children. Her limited Lakota allowed her to understand one word being repeated, Crow. The enemy tribe Winona had mentioned. The raiders came at dusk, sweeping down from the northern hills. Mary watched in terror from the teepee as the camp erupted in organized chaos. Women and children fled to defensive positions while warriors rode out to meet the attack. The clash was brutal and swift, painted warriors colliding in clouds of dust and war cries. Through it all, Mary could see Lakota, distinctive on his spotted war horse, his war bonnet streaming behind him as he rallied his warriors. He fought with a controlled ferocity that was both terrible and magnificent to witness. When a Crow warrior broke through toward the camp where the children huddled, Lakota wheeled his horse and intercepted him, the two men grappling until Lakota emerged victorious. The battle turned, the Crow raiders retreating into the gathering darkness, as the Lakota warriors pursued them briefly before returning. Mary found herself scanning anxiously for Lakota's figure. Relief flooded through her when she saw him riding back, though he swayed slightly in his saddle. It was only when he dismounted that she saw the blood. An arrow had found a gap in his protection, embedding itself in his shoulder. He walked steadily enough, but his face was gray with pain. Without thinking, Mary rushed from the teepee. "You're hurt," she said, reaching toward the wound. He caught her hand, his grip still strong despite his injury. "Is nothing. It's not nothing. You need—" She stopped, realizing she was arguing with him in public, in front of his people. But he was studying her with an odd expression, something almost like wonder. "You worry for me?" he asked softly. Mary pulled her hand back, confused by her own actions. Why had she run to him? Why did the sight of his blood make her stomach clench with fear? You need healing," she said lamely. He nodded slowly, that strange look still in his eyes. "Yes, perhaps I do." As the medicine man tended to Lakota's wound, Mary retreated to her teepee, her mind in turmoil. She had seen him as a protector today, not just of her but of his entire people. She had feared for him, genuinely feared for the man who had taken everything from her. That night, as the camp settled into watchful quiet, Mary fingered her locket and tried to make sense of the changes happening within her. The solid walls of her hatred were developing cracks, letting in glimpses of a truth she wasn't ready to face, that her captor was becoming something else entirely, and she didn't know how to stop it. The first snows came early that year, dusting the hills like flowers scattered by a careless hand. Mary had never experienced winter on the open plains, and the bite of the wind through the buffalo-hide teepees was sharper than any cold she'd known. She watched the camp transform, the people adapting with practiced efficiency to the changing season. It was during a particularly fierce storm that danger struck again, though not from human enemies. The howling had started at dusk, long, mournful cries that made the dogs cower and whine. Wolves, driven down from the mountains by early snow and hunger. Mary was returning from the stream with water when she heard the screams. A pack had descended on the horse herd, and in the chaos, young Takala, barely 8 winters, had been separated from the other children. She saw him stumbling through the snow, 3 gray shadows closing in. Without thought, Mary dropped the water vessels and ran. She scooped up a burning brand from a fire and charged toward the boy, shouting at the top of her lungs. The wolves hesitated, yellow eyes gleaming in the twilight. She swung the torch in wide arcs, placing herself between the predators and the child. "Get back!" she screamed, though whether at the wolves or the boy, she wasn't sure. One wolf, bolder than the rest, lunged. Mary thrust the torch at its face, feeling the heat singe her own skin. The animal yelped and retreated, but its packmates circled, looking for an opening. Her heart hammered as she backed slowly toward the camp, pushing Takala behind her. Then Lakota was there, along with several warriors. Their arrows sang through the air, and the wolves fled into the gathering darkness. Mary's legs gave out, and she sank into the snow, Takala clinging to her and sobbing. "Brave woman," one of the warriors said in accented English, and Mary was shocked to recognize him as one who had always glared at her with suspicion. Lakota knelt beside her, his dark eyes intense. "You risk yourself for our child." "He's just a boy," Mary said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "I couldn't just come." He helped her to her feet, his touch gentle. "You are cold." He led her not to her usual teepee, but to his own. Inside, the space was warm, heated by a carefully tended fire. The buffalo robes were thick and soft, the walls decorated with weapons, shields, and painted stories she couldn't read. It smelled of smoke, leather, and something indefinably male. "Sit," he commanded, wrapping a heavy robe around her shoulders. Mary sat, still trembling from cold and delayed fear. Dakota prepared something in a small pot over the fire, a tea that smelled of herbs and honey. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Why?" he asked, settling across from her. "Why save Lakota child?" Mary considered the question. Why had she acted without thinking? "He was afraid," she said finally. "And alone. I know what that feels like." Something shifted in Dakota's expression. "You no longer alone." "I'm a captive," Mary reminded him, though the words lacked their usual bite. "No." He shook his head firmly. "You are." He paused, clearly frustrated by the language barrier. Then he switched to Lakota, speaking earnestly, his hands moving expressively. "I don't understand," Mary said softly. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You are part of us now. The children see it, the elders see it. Today, warriors see it." He touched his chest, over his heart. "I see it from beginning." Mary's breath caught. The walls she'd built so carefully were crumbling faster now. "I can't be. My world, my people." "Your people burn our lodges, kill our buffalo, take our children to white schools, make them forget who they are." His voice held old pain. "But you different. You see T'Challa as child, not as enemy." "He's innocent," Mary protested. "Yes, as you are innocent of your people's crimes, as I am innocent of mine." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. "We are all more than our people's hatred." Mary closed her eyes, overwhelmed. His hand was warm against her cold skin, calloused but gentle. When she opened them, he was studying her with such intensity it took her breath away. "I cannot forget my husband," she whispered. "I not ask you to forget, I ask you to live." A sound outside broke the moment, Winona's voice calling. Dakota withdrew his hand and responded in Lakota. The old woman entered, took one look at them, and launched into what sounded like a scolding. Dakota bore it with patience, though Mary caught what might have been amusement in his eyes. Finally, Winona turned to Mary. "You saved T'Challa, his mother, my daughter. She grateful. Want to meet." Over the following days, Mary found her status in the camp shifting dramatically. T'Challa's mother, a young woman named Maka, embraced her with tears. Other mothers nodded respectfully. Even Iyota's hostility seemed tempered, though she still watched Mary with suspicious eyes whenever Dakota was near. The chief himself maintained a careful distance in public, but Mary was increasingly aware of his presence. He would appear when she struggled with heavy work, wordlessly taking the burden. When her worn dress finally tore beyond repair, new clothing appeared in her teepee, a doe-skin dress decorated with modest quill work, warm leggings, and fur-lined moccasins. "I can't accept these," she told Winona. The old woman snorted. "You prefer frieze, stubborn white woman. Clothes are clothes." But Mary knew they were more than that. Accepting them felt like accepting her place here, and she wasn't ready for that. Yet, when the next storm hit, dropping the temperature dangerously, she put them on. The soft leather felt strange against her skin, but warm and practical. She was drawing water through a hole cut in the river ice when Dakota found her. He stopped short, seeing her in traditional dress for the first time. Something flared in his eyes. Approval, desire, possessiveness, before he controlled his expression. "It suits you," he said simply. "The clothes are very warm. Thank you." Mary focused on filling her vessel, uncomfortably aware of his scrutiny. "Mary." Her name sounded different in his accent, softer somehow. "Tonight, there is ceremony. For winter, for protection. You come?" It wasn't really a question, and Mary found herself nodding. The ceremony was unlike anything she had experienced. The entire camp gathered in the largest teepee, the space thick with sacred smoke and drum beats that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Mary understood little of the prayers and songs, but she felt their power. When Dakota stood to speak, his voice carrying authority and faith in equal measure, she found herself mesmerized. Later, as people shared food and stories. An elder approached her. Through Winona's translation, he told her, "You have warrior spirit, like she who runs with wolves." It took Mary a moment to realize he meant her confrontation with the pack. "Is that to be my name?" she asked. The elder smiled. "Names must be earned. You are earning yours." As the gathering wound down, Lakota appeared at her side. "Walk with me." They stepped out into the crystal-clear night. The storm had passed, leaving the world pristine and silver under the moon. Their breath clouded in the frigid air as they walked to the edge of camp. "Your husband," Lakota said suddenly. "Tell me of him." Mary was surprised by the request. "Samuel was kind, hard-working. He believed in the dream of the frontier, in building something from nothing." "You loved him?" "Yes." Mary's voice was soft. "He was a good man. This is why you fought for his land, for his memory." Mary nodded, her throat tight. They stood in silence, looking out at the snow-covered plains that stretched endlessly under the stars. "My wife died 3 winters past," Lakota said quietly. "Sickness the white traders bring. She was mother of my son. Good woman. I mourned long time." "I'm sorry," Mary said, meaning it. "Heart heals." He continued. "Not forget, but heals. Makes room for new." He turned to face her fully. "My heart makes room for you, Mary, but I wait until your heart ready to heal." The honesty in his words, the patient certainty, overwhelmed her. She felt tears freezing on her cheeks before she realized she was crying for Samuel, for her lost life, for the confusion of feelings she couldn't name. Lakota stepped closer, not touching, just sheltering her from the wind with his body. "Cry," he said gently. "Tears clean the heart." They stood there in the winter night, captor and captive no longer, but 2 souls who had known loss and were finding, against all odds and reason, the possibility of something new. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and indifferent, while below, human hearts struggled with the complexities of grief, healing, and unexpected connection. When Mary finally stopped crying, she was surprised to find herself leaning against Lakota's solid warmth. She straightened quickly, but not before she felt his hand briefly touch her hair, a gesture so tender it nearly started her tears again. "Come," he said. "It's too cold." As they walked back to camp, Mary knew something fundamental had shifted. The walls weren't just cracking now. They were crumbling entirely. And beneath them, something new and terrifying and possibly beautiful was beginning to grow. The spring moon hung low and heavy when the scouts brought word that changed everything. Mary was helping Mecca repair a parfleche container when the riders thundered into camp, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cool night air. She didn't need to understand their rapid Lakota to read the urgency in their gestures and the way Lakota's face hardened as he listened. Within minutes, the camp transformed. Warriors checked weapons while women began packing essentials. Mary caught fragments of conversation. Blue coats, many soldiers, moving north. The U.S. Army was conducting a massive sweep, forcing all tribes onto reservations or destroying those who resisted. Winona found Mary standing uncertainly amid the controlled chaos. "Pack quick," the old woman said tersely. "We move before sun." "Where will we go?" "North to grandmother's land." Canada, Mary realized. Maybe safe there, maybe not, but here is death. As Mary gathered the few possessions she'd accumulated, the doe-skin dress, a bone-sewing awl Chumani had given her, her mother's locket, she felt the weight of a terrible decision approaching. The Army's presence meant potential rescue, a return to her world, but it also meant violence, possibly the destruction of people who were no longer strangers to her. The camp disbanded with practiced efficiency, teepees coming down in minutes, travois loaded and attached to horses. Mary found herself assigned to help with the children, keeping them quiet and calm during the dangerous journey. Takala clung to her hand, his young face serious beyond his years. They traveled by night, resting in hidden coulees during the day. Lakota rode constantly between scouting ahead and checking the rear guard, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. On the third night, as they paused to water the horses at a stream, he found Mary sitting apart, wrestling with her thoughts. "You are troubled," he observed, settling beside her. Mary looked at him, really looked at him. The moonlight revealed new lines of strain around his eyes, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "If the soldiers find us, they not take you," he said firmly. "I protect you." "That's not what I meant." Mary struggled to articulate her confusion. "I should want to be rescued. I should want to go back. But, I'm afraid of what will happen to all of you, to the children, to—" She couldn't finish. His hand covered hers where it rested on her knee. "You fear for us? Is that so strange? From white woman taken by force? Yes, strange, beautiful, but strange." His thumb traced circles on her hand. "What does your heart tell you?" Before Mary could answer, a commotion erupted from the main group. Riders were approaching, not soldiers, but another band of Lakota, fleeing north like themselves. Among them was a white man, but dressed in native clothing. Mary's heart lurched with recognition. It was James McKenna, a trader from Willow Creek. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Mary! Mary Sullivan! By God, we thought you were dead!" The reunion was awkward, conducted under the watchful eyes of warriors from both bands. McKenna had been trading with this group when the Army's campaign began, and had chosen to flee with them rather than risk being caught in the crossfire. "Your disappearance caused quite a stir," he told her, speaking quickly in English. "The Army's been using it as justification for this whole campaign. Savage depredations. They're calling it. Colonel Morrison swears he won't rest until every hostile is dead or on a reservation." "These people aren't savages," Mary said sharply, surprising herself with her vehemence. McKenna studied her, taking in her native dress, her protective stance near the children. "Stockholm Syndrome," he muttered. "Don't worry, we'll get you back to civilization." "I don't need—" Mary began. But Lakota appeared, his presence immediately commanding. "This man troubles you?" he asked in Lakota. "No," Mary replied in the same language, noting McKenna's shock. "He knew me before." The conversation that followed was tense, conducted in a mixture of languages and gestures. McKenna insisted Mary should come with his group, where he could better protect her and eventually return her to white society. Dakota's expression grew stonier with each word, though he maintained his dignity. Finally, Dakota turned to Mary. "Choose," he said simply in English. "His path or ours. I not force you." The moment crystallized everything Mary had been struggling with. On one side stood her old world, safety, familiarity, a return to her own people who would pity her and whisper behind their hands, but eventually let her rebuild some semblance of a life. On the other stood uncertainty, danger, and a man whose dark eyes held promises she was only beginning to understand. "Mary, be sensible," McKenna urged. "These people are doomed. The Army won't stop. You'll die with them if you stay." "Maybe," Mary said quietly, then louder. "But I stay." McKenna's face flushed. "You don't know what you're saying. They've confused you, maybe threatened you." "No." Mary stepped closer to Dakota, decision crystallizing into certainty. "They've shown me kindness. They've given me purpose, and I won't abandon them now." "You're choosing a savage over your own kind." McKenna's voice was ugly with disbelief. Dakota moved then, faster than Mary could follow, his knife suddenly at McKenna's throat, but his voice was calm. "You call us savage, but I not force her. You try force her. Who is savage?" "Dakota, no," Mary said, touching his arm. The muscles were coiled tight beneath her fingers. "Let him go, please." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Dakota stepped back, sheathing his knife. "Go," he told McKenna. "Tell white soldiers Mary Sullivan is dead. She chose this. Respect her choice." McKenna left with his group at dawn, but not before making one last attempt. "I'll tell them you're alive," he warned Mary. "They'll come for you." "Then tell them I don't want to be rescued," Mary replied, after they were gone. The combined bands continued north, but the encounter had changed things. Word of Mary's choice spread through both groups. Some viewed her with new respect, others with suspicion. What kind of white woman would choose their difficult life over the comfort of her own people? That night, as they camped in a hidden valley, Lakota came to where Mary sat by a small fire. He brought 2 bowls of stew and settled beside her, closer than propriety usually allowed. "You could have gone," he said after a while. "Been safe." "Safe," Mary laughed bitterly. "To live as an object of pity, to have people whisper about what might have happened to me, to marry some man who would always wonder if I was ruined." She used the English word, knowing he would understand. "You are not ruined," Lakota said fiercely. "You are." He switched to Lakota, words flowing passionate and musical. "I still don't understand everything," Mary said. He took her face in his hands, gently but firmly. "Then understand this. You are brave, beautiful, sacred to me, not ruined, never ruined." The intensity in his eyes made her tremble. "Lakota." "I wait," he said, releasing her. "I say I wait for your heart, but Mary, armies come. Time grows short. I am man, not spirit. My waiting has limits." The raw honesty in his voice undid her. All her carefully maintained barriers, already weakened, finally shattered. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of me?" "No, not anymore." She took a shaky breath. "I'm afraid of what I feel. It's too fast, too much. Samuel's been gone less than a year, and you live," Lakota finished. "Heartbeats, blood flows. This is not betrayal of dead. This is choice of living." A wolf howled in the distance, and Mary shivered, not from fear this time, but from the weight of standing at a crossroads. The army was coming. Their way of life was ending. And in the midst of it all, her heart was making choices her mind couldn't yet accept. "I need time," she whispered. "Time is luxury we may not have." Lakota replied, but he smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his stern features. "But for you, Mary who runs with wolves, I find more patience." He rose to leave, but Mary caught his hand. "Thank you for not forcing me to go with McKenna, for giving me the choice." "You give me choice too," he said softly. "Choice to hope." As he disappeared into the darkness, Mary sat alone with her thoughts. She had crossed a line today, chosen a path that her old self would have found incomprehensible. The distant howl came again, and this time she heard it differently, not as a threat, but as a call to wildness, to freedom, to a life beyond the narrow boundaries she had known. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new decisions, but tonight, under stars that didn't care about the divisions between peoples, Mary Sullivan allowed herself to admit what her heart had known for weeks. She was falling in love with the man who had taken her captive and then, somehow, set her free. The attack came at dawn, just as the morning star faded into a lightening sky. Mary woke to the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of rifle fire. She had barely struggled from her robes when the teepee walls shuddered, bullets tearing through the buffalo hide like deadly hail. "Get down!" Winona hissed, pulling Mary to the ground as screams erupted throughout the camp. The cavalry had found them. Blue-coated soldiers charged through the camp in disciplined lines, their Springfield rifles spitting fire. Warriors scrambled for weapons while women grabbed children and fled toward the river. The air filled with gun smoke, war cries, and the terrible sounds of battle. Mary crawled to the teepee opening, her heart hammering as she searched for Lakota. She spotted him mounting his warhorse, his rifle already in hand, rallying warriors for a countercharge. Their eyes met across the chaos for one brief moment, a lifetime of words in a single glance, before he wheeled his horse toward the attacking soldiers. "Move!" Winona dragged Mary from the teepee. "To the ravine!" They ran, stumbling over abandoned possessions and the unthinkable forms of those who hadn't been quick enough. Mary clutched Takala's hand as they fled, the boy's face white with terror. Behind them, the battle raged, the sharp reports of army rifles against the lighter crack of the warriors' mixed weapons. They reached a shallow ravine where other women and children huddled. Mary looked back to see the camp in flames, soldiers methodically torching the teepees. Her chest tightened as she searched desperately for Lakota among the fighting. But smoke and distance made it impossible to distinguish individual warriors. Then she heard it, her name being called in English. "Mary Sullivan! We know you're here. Come out peacefully and you won't be harmed." Her blood ran cold. McKenna had told them after all. "Mrs. Sullivan!" The voice came again, closer now. "I'm Lieutenant Harrison from Fort Robinson. We're here to rescue you." Winona gripped her arm. "You go. They maybe stop shooting." "No," Mary said fiercely. "I won't." A soldier appeared at the edge of the ravine, his young face lighting up when he saw her. "There she is. I found her." What followed was chaos. Soldiers swarmed the ravine, pulling Mary away from the others despite her struggles. She fought them, screaming in Lakota and English, trying to get back to Takala and the others. But the soldiers were too many, too strong. "Ma'am, please." Lieutenant Harrison tried to calm her. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." "This is my home," Mary cried. But they weren't listening. They dragged her to where the cavalry had regrouped, the battle winding down as warriors retreated to defend the fleeing women and children. Mary's heart shattered when she saw the forms scattered across the ground, warriors she had known, women who had become friends. The carefully ordered camp was now a smoking ruin. "Dear God," Lieutenant Harrison muttered, seeing her dressed in native clothing. "What did those savages do to you?" "Where is your chief?" a gruff colonel demanded. Riding up, this had to be Morrison, the one McKenna had mentioned. "The tall one. Lakota. Where is he?" "I don't know," Mary said truthfully, praying he had escaped. Morrison's face darkened. "Search the bodies," he commanded. "I want confirmation." As soldiers picked through the battlefield, Mary was wrapped in an army blanket and placed on a wagon. She felt numb, disconnected from her body, as if watching everything from a great distance. They wouldn't let her help with the wounded, wouldn't let her return to search for survivors. "The Red Savage is down," a soldier called out, and Mary's heart stopped. They dragged a body forward, tall, powerful, wearing a chief's regalia, but as they turned the face up, Mary nearly sobbed with relief. It wasn't Lakota. The relief was followed immediately by guilt. This was someone's husband, father, chief. Someone she probably knew. "Not him," Morrison spat. "Keep searching, and get those prisoners secured." Prisoners. Mary turned to see a small group of captured women and children, Maka among them. Takala broke free and ran to Mary, but a soldier caught him roughly. "Don't hurt him," Mary cried. "He's just a child." "Nits make lice," one soldier muttered. But Lieutenant Harrison intervened. "There's no call for that. Private. They're prisoners, not targets." The journey back to Fort Robinson took 3 days. Mary rode in the supply wagon, treated like fragile china by soldiers who couldn't reconcile the proper white woman they'd expected to rescue with the fierce creature in buckskins who spoke Lakota and wept for her captors. At the fort, she was immediately taken to the commander's wife, Mrs. Colonel Brennan, a stern woman who looked at Mary's native dress with undisguised horror. "My dear child," she said, "what trials you must have endured, but you're safe now. We'll get you proper clothing and send word to your family." "I have no family," Mary said dully. "My husband is dead." "Well then, we'll make arrangements. There are good Christian families who take in women in your situation, help them readjust to civilized life." The first thing they did was burn her doe-skin dress. Mary watched the flames consume it, along with the quill work Maka had painstakingly created, and felt another piece of herself turn to ash. They cut her hair, which had grown long and wild, into a respectable style. They gave her a black dress, mourning clothes, though they didn't know she mourned for the living as much as the dead. The questions began immediately. The fort commander, the army chaplain, even a doctor, all wanting to know about her ordeal. Had she been mistreated, violated, forced into savage practices? They couldn't understand when she insisted she had been treated well, that she had chosen to stay. It's common for captives to develop sympathy for their captors. The doctor explained patiently, as if she were a child. It's a form of mental confusion brought on by trauma. It will pass with time and proper care. Mary stopped trying to explain after that. She submitted to their care with hollow compliance, all the while listening desperately for news of the band. The prisoners brought to the fort were mostly women and children, held in a fenced area awaiting transport to the reservation. Mary tried to visit them but was firmly refused. "It's not appropriate. Mrs. Brennan insisted. You must put that chapter of your life behind you." But at night, when the fort slept, Mary would stand at her window and listen to the distant sound of mourning songs from the prisoner compound. She pressed her hand to her heart, where her locket lay, the one thing they hadn't taken, and whispered prayers in Lakota for Dakota's safety. On her 5th day at the fort, Lieutenant Harrison came to see her. He was young, earnest, and clearly disturbed by something. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began awkwardly, "I thought you should know. We received word from our scouts. The chief, Dakota, he's still alive. He's gathering the scattered bands, trying to reach Canada." Mary's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank God," she breathed. Harrison frowned. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. He's been classified as a hostile. There's a bounty on his head. Every soldier and bounty hunter in the territory will be looking for him." "Because of me?" Mary asked, horrified. "Partly. The colonel takes it as a personal insult that you—" Harrison flushed. "Well, that a savage would dare take a white woman and corrupt her loyalties." Mary sank into a chair. Her presence here, her rescue, had painted an even larger target on Dakota's back. "Lieutenant," she said urgently, "you seem like a decent man. You must understand, I wasn't corrupted. I wasn't forced. I chose—" "Please, ma'am," Harrison interrupted, clearly uncomfortable. "Such talk will only make things worse for you. There are already whispers about your enthusiasm for savage ways. If you want any chance at a normal life, you must put it all behind you." That night, Mary made her decision. She couldn't stay here, trapped in a cage of propriety and willful misunderstanding. She had to find a way back to Dakota, to her true life, before it was too late. But even as she began to plan, she could feel the weight of two worlds pressing down on her, one that would never accept who she had become, and one that might no longer exist by the time she found her way back to it. The morning songs continued in the darkness, and Mary added her silent voice to theirs, grieving for all that had been lost and all that might yet be taken. The town of Millfield seemed to close in around Mary like a fist. Mrs. Brennan had arranged for her to stay with the Reverend and Mrs. Hartwell, a childless couple who ran the local church and were known for their work rehabilitating fallen women. Mary wanted to laugh at the irony. She had fallen. Indeed, but not in the way they imagined. The Hartwells' house was a narrow 2-story building that smelled of lye soap and righteousness. Mrs. Hartwell, a pinched woman with graying hair scraped into a merciless bun, showed Mary to a small room under the eaves. "We rise at 5 for morning prayers," she informed Mary crisply. "Breakfast is at 6, after which you'll help with household duties. Idle hands are the devil's playground, especially for women in your circumstances." Mary's circumstances. That's what everyone called it. As if her time with the Lakota were a disease to be cured through prayer and propriety. The other women in town were worse. At the general store, conversations would halt when she entered. At church, she could feel their eyes boring into her back, could hear the whispers that followed her like shadows. They say she wore savage clothes willingly, spoke their heathen language. Lord knows what else she did. Only one person showed her any genuine kindness. Clara Mason, the school teacher. A spinster in her 30s who had come west for adventure and found only disappointment. Clara would sometimes invite Mary for tea, where they would sit in careful conversation about safe topics like weather and needlework. But even Clara couldn't hide her curiosity entirely. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the windows, she asked quietly, "Were they truly as savage as everyone says?" Mary set down her teacup carefully. "They were people, Clara. They laughed, cried, loved their children, cared for their elderly. They showed me more genuine kindness than—" She stopped, seeing Clara's uncomfortable expression. "I'm sure it seemed that way," Clara said gently, as if Mary were confused. "But surely you're glad to be back among civilized people." That night, Mary lay in her narrow bed listening to the rain and remembering a different storm. When Lakota had wrapped her in buffalo robes and told her stories of his people while the wind howled outside. "I lead warriors, but you lead my heart," he had said. The words echoed in the darkness, a promise and a torment. Weeks crawled by in a gray succession of prayers, chores, and judgmental silences. Mary learned to keep her head down, to speak only when spoken to never mention her life with the Lakota. But at night, she would press her face into her pillow and whisper Lakota words, afraid she would forget them, forget everything that mattered. The breaking point came one Sunday after a particularly vicious sermon about the godless heathens and the Christian duty to civilize the savage races. As the congregation filed out, Mary overheard Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, speaking to her circle. Of course, one can't help but wonder about Mrs. Sullivan, living among them for so long, participating in their barbaric ways. No decent man would have her now. Naturally, she's ruined for proper society. Indeed, another woman agreed. Though I suppose she might find work in one of those establishments in Denver. They say such women often end up there. Mary's hands clenched into fists. But before she could speak, someone else did. "That's quite enough, ladies." It was Thomas Garrett, the local newspaper editor, a widower in his 40s with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. He had always nodded politely to Mary on the street. "Mrs. Sullivan has endured trials none of us can imagine. She deserves our compassion, not our condemnation." The women huffed and moved away, but Thomas lingered. "I apologize for them," he said quietly to Mary. "Small minds in small towns often produce great cruelties." "Thank you," Mary managed, surprised by his defense. He studied her thoughtfully. "I've traveled extensively in the territories. Mrs. Sullivan, I've met many native peoples. I find them far more honorable than some would have us believe." It was the first time anyone had suggested the Lakota might be anything other than savages. Mary felt tears prick her eyes. "Would you?" Thomas hesitated. "Would you perhaps join me for dinner sometime? I would be honored to hear your perspectives. The true ones, not the versions others expect." Mary knew she should refuse. A widow dining alone with a man would fuel even more gossip. But the prospect of genuine conversation, of someone who might actually listen, was too tempting. "I would like that," she said. Their dinners became a weekly occurrence, always chaperoned by Thomas's elderly housekeeper to maintain propriety. Thomas was intelligent, well-read, and genuinely interested in her experiences. For the first time since her rescue, Mary found herself able to speak freely about her life with the Lakota. "This chief, Lakota," Thomas said one evening, "you cared for him." It wasn't a question. Mary looked down at her hands. "Yes, and he for you." "He said I led his heart," Mary whispered. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," he said finally. "Consumption. I thought I would never, but life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Mary looked up to find him watching her with an expression she recognized. Longing, hope, loneliness. Her heart sank. Thomas was a good man, offering her everything a woman in her position should want: respectability, security, a chance to rebuild a proper life. "Thomas," she began gently. "I know," he said, holding up a hand. "Your heart is elsewhere, but Mary, I must speak plainly. There's talk of sending an expedition to Canada to pursue the last hostile bands. Your chief, if he's alive, he'll never be safe. Neither will you if you somehow manage to find him. But here, with me, you could have a life. Not the life you dreamed of, perhaps, but a life nonetheless." That night, Mary stood at her window staring at the distant mountains. Somewhere beyond them, Lakota might still be alive, still fighting for his people's survival. Or he might be dead, and she was clinging to a ghost. The sensible choice was clear: accept Thomas's eventual proposal, become a newspaper editor's wife, let the past fade into memory. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the prairie wind, still hear the drums and songs, still see Dakota's eyes in the firelight. Choose life, he had told her. But what was life without the freedom to love whom her heart had chosen? A week later, news arrived that changed everything. A trapper passing through town brought word of a small band of Lakota still evading capture near the Milk River, led by a tall chief with a scarred jaw. Mary's heart leaped. Dakota was alive. That same night, she heard the Hartwells discussing her in hushed tones. The Committee for Moral Rehabilitation is considering sending her to the asylum in Chicago, Mrs. Hartwell said. They believe her attachment to savage ways indicates mental disturbance. Perhaps it's for the best. Reverend Hartwell agreed. Professional help might cure her delusions. An asylum. They would lock her away for the crime of loving the wrong man, of refusing to hate those she was supposed to hate. Mary pressed her hand to her mother's locket and made her choice. She would not wait for them to cage her in a different kind of prison. She began to plan. She would need supplies, a horse, directions to the Milk River. It would be dangerous. A woman alone in the wilderness, pursued as both a fugitive and a madwoman. But the alternative was a living death, and Dakota had taught her to choose life. In her small room, Mary knelt and prayed, not the Christian prayers the Hartwells demanded, but older prayers, in Lakota, to spirits of wind and earth and sky. Guide me back to him, she begged. Let me find my way home. Outside, the respectable town of Millfield slept peacefully, unaware that the woman they had tried so hard to save was planning to lose herself again, this time by her own choice, with her whole heart, holding nothing back. Mary fled Millfield on a moonless night in late September, taking only what she could carry: dried meat and hardtack stolen from the Hartwells' pantry, a canteen, a knife, and the small pouch of coins she'd hidden away. She had traded her mother's locket to the livery stable boy for an old mare and his silence until morning. The first days were the hardest. She followed the river north, keeping to deer trails and avoiding settlements. Her body, softened by months of town living, protested every mile. Blisters formed and burst on her hands and feet. Rain soaked through her cloak, leaving her shivering through endless nights. But she pressed on, driven by a determination stronger than physical pain. On the fourth day, she heard horses behind her, heart pounding. She guided her mare into a thick stand of cottonwoods and waited, barely breathing. 3 riders passed, bounty hunters by their look, rough men with rifles across their saddles. She heard her name carried on the wind and knew the Hartwells had discovered her escape. She traveled only at night after that, hiding in caves and thickets during daylight. The mare went lame after a week, and Mary had to release her, continuing on foot. She foraged for berries and roots the way Winona had taught her, drank from streams, and slowly felt the soft town woman falling away like an old skin. 2 weeks into her journey, exhausted and fevered from exposure, Mary stumbled into a camp of Métis buffalo hunters. These mixed-blood people, part French and part native, lived between worlds like she did. They took pity on her, especially when she spoke to them in halting Lakota mixed with English. "You seek Dakota's band?" asked their leader. "An old man named Baptiste. Dangerous journey. That soldiers everywhere now. Lakota pushed far north, almost to Medicine Line. I have to find him," Mary said simply. Baptiste's wife, Marie, clicked her tongue. "Love makes fools of us all," she said, but not unkindly. She gave Mary warmer clothes, a mixture of native and European styles, and provisions for her journey. "Follow the Milk River," Baptiste advised. "But careful. Army patrols watch the borders. They don't want Indians crossing into grandmother's land." Mary traveled with renewed purpose, though the journey grew more treacherous. Snow began to fall, early even for the northern plains. She navigated by instinct and prayer. her dreams filled with Dakota's voice calling her home. Then, on a morning when frost silvered the grasslands, she saw smoke rising from a hidden valley. Her heart hammered as she approached, recognizing the arrangement of teepees, the patterns of movement. This was a Lakota camp. But was it his? A sentry spotted her, shouting an alarm. Warriors surrounded her quickly, weapons drawn. She raised her hands, calling out in Lakota, "I am Mary. I seek Chief Dakota. I am she who runs with wolves." Recognition dawned on some faces. One warrior, she knew him, brave elk, lowered his rifle. "It cannot be. The white woman?" "Please," Mary said, her voice breaking. "Is he here? Is Dakota alive?" They led her into camp, where her appearance caused a sensation. People emerged from teepees, staring in disbelief. She saw familiar faces, some welcoming, others suspicious. The band was smaller now, diminished by war and flight, but they had survived. Then she saw him. Dakota emerged from a council teepee, and time seemed to stop. He looked older, worn by hardship and loss. A new scar marked his shoulder where a bullet had found him. But his eyes, those dark eyes that had haunted her dreams, widened with something between disbelief and joy. "Mary?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain, as if she might be a vision. She took a step forward, then another, and then she was running. He caught her as she threw herself into his arms, solid and real and alive. She was sobbing, speaking incoherently in English and Lakota, and he was holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You came back," he murmured in wonder. "My heart, you came back. I choose you," she gasped between sobs. "I choose this life. I choose our people. I choose you. Always you." He pulled back to look at her face, his hands cradling her cheeks with infinite tenderness. "The soldiers. Your people?" "They're not my people," Mary said fiercely. "You are. This is my home." Something broke in his expression then. All the careful control, the stoic strength required of a chief. "I thought I lost you," he admitted, his voice raw. "When they took you, He switched to Lakota, words pouring out, how he had searched, how he had mourned, how he had led his people north while his heart remained in that burned camp where he'd last seen her. Around them, the camp had gathered. Winona pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered face as she embraced Mary. "Foolish girl," she scolded. "Brave, foolish girl." Takala ran to her, now taller than when she'd left, and threw his arms around her waist. Mecca followed, having escaped the reservation with several others, weeping as she touched Mary's face in wonder. But there were gaps too, faces missing, families torn apart. The cost of survival was written in every absence. Dakota's son was among the missing, taken to a boarding school, location unknown. The pain of it was etched in every line of Dakota's face. That night, the camp held a ceremony of return. Mary sat beside Dakota as drums beat and voices rose in songs of grief and celebration intertwined. When the elders spoke, they named her truly, Winyan Waste Win, good woman who returns. You left as captive. One elder said, you return as one who chooses. This is sacred thing. Later, when the fires had burned low, Dakota led Mary to a rise overlooking the camp. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the clear northern air. We are not safe here, he said quietly. Soon we must cross Medicine Line into grandmother's land. Life will be hard, different. We will be refugees in strange country. I know, Mary said. You could have had comfortable life with whites. Safe life. A caged life. Mary corrected. They would have locked me in an asylum for the crime of loving you. He turned to her then, his control finally, completely gone. And do you love me? Mary reached up to touch his scarred jaw, feeling him tremble under her fingers. With every breath, with every heartbeat, beyond reason, beyond worlds, beyond everything I was taught to believe. He kissed her then, under the vast prairie sky, and it was like coming home after the longest, darkest journey. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. My heart, he whispered. My fierce, brave heart. I lead warriors. But you, I lead your heart, Mary finished, as you lead mine. They stood there as dawn approached, two souls who had found each other across impossible divides. Behind them, the camp stirred with morning life. Ahead lay uncertainty, exile, hardship, the challenge of keeping their culture alive in a foreign land. But they would face it together. Mary had crossed prairies and mountains, defied her own people, risked everything for this moment. She had been captured and made free, lost and found, broken and remade, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Lakota took her hand, and they walked back to their people, their family, their future, their home. The prairie wind sang around them, carrying the scent of sage and snow, sorrow and joy, endings and beginnings. They did not know what tomorrow would bring, but they had today, and they had each other. And sometimes that is enough to build a life upon, even in a world that said their love was impossible, their union forbidden, their very existence a challenge to the order of things. Love had led them through fire and storm, across cultures and conflicts, beyond the boundaries others had drawn, and love would lead them still, into whatever dawn awaited. Hearts united against all odds. The horizon stretched endless before them, and together, hand in hand, they walked toward it. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love conquering impossible odds in the Wild West. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier days. What did you think of Mary and Lakota's journey? Share your thoughts, and let's discuss this epic love story together.